"This house doesn't belong to someone like you," the officer sneered, planting a small bag of white powder behind the couch cushion. But when the black man calmly pulled out his police badge, the corrupt cop's world came crashing down in seconds. The autumn rain hammered against the windows of the modest two-story house in suburban Detroit, Michigan, as Detective Marcus Williams finished his morning coffee. At 42, Marcus had seen enough in his 20 years of law enforcement to know that evil often wore a badge. What he didn't expect was for that evil to walk through his own front door on a quiet Tuesday morning in October 2023. The doorbell rang at exactly 8:47 a.m. Marcus glanced through the peephole and saw two uniformed officers from the local precinct standing on his porch, their faces grim under the grey morning light. One was tall and lean with cold blue eyes, while the other appeared nervous, constantly shifting his weight from foot to foot. "Can I help you, officers?" Marcus asked as he opened the door, his instincts immediately on high alert. "Hey everyone, if you're enjoying this story so far, please hit that like button and subscribe to our channel. Also, let us know in the comments which city you're watching from. We love hearing from our amazing viewers worldwide." "We received a report about suspicious activity at this address," the tall officer, whose nameplate read Braidley, stated with barely concealed disdain. "We need to conduct a search." Marcus raised an eyebrow. "Suspicious activity? I'm afraid there's been some mistake. I'm Detective Marcus Williams, and this is my home." Officer Bradley's lips curled into a smirk that made Marcus's blood run cold. "Sure you are, buddy. And I'm the president. Now step aside before this gets complicated." The second officer, whose tag read Reynolds, looked uncomfortable as he glanced between his partner and Marcus. Something was clearly wrong with this picture, but Reynolds seemed too intimidated to speak up. As the officers pushed their way into his living room, Marcus felt the familiar weight of injustice pressing down on his shoulders. The same weight he'd felt as a young black man growing up in Chicago's South Side. The same weight that had driven him to become a police officer in the first place. But this time was different. This time he had the power to fight back. "I'm going to need to see that warrant," Marcus said calmly, pulling out his phone to record the interaction. "Put that damn phone away," Bradley snarled, his hand moving dangerously close to his weapon. "We don't need a warrant when we have probable cause." Marcus watched in disbelief as Bradley began systematically searching his home, roughly going through drawers and cabinets with complete disregard for his property. Reynolds stood by the door, his discomfort growing more obvious by the minute. The real shock came when Marcus saw Bradley slip something from his pocket, a small plastic bag containing what appeared to be cocaine, and deliberately place it behind the couch cushions when he thought no one was looking. "Well, well, well," Bradley announced loudly, his voice dripping with false surprise. "Look what we have here, Reynolds. Looks like our detective friend has been dealing drugs." The room fell silent, except for the steady patter of rain against the windows. Marcus felt his heart racing, not from fear, but from a burning rage that threatened to consume him. 20 years of dedicated service, of fighting corruption, of trying to be the change he wanted to see in law enforcement. And now he was being framed by the very system he'd sworn to protect. But Marcus Williams hadn't become the youngest police chief in the history of Springfield, Illinois, by backing down from corrupt cops. As Bradley reached for his handcuffs with a satisfied grin, Marcus calmly reached into his jacket pocket. The next few seconds would change everything, not just for Marcus, but for the entire Detroit Police Department. Because what Officer Bradley didn't know was that he had just made the biggest mistake of his career. And Marcus Williams was about to show him exactly why you should never judge a book by its cover. What happens when a corrupt cop tries to frame someone who has the power to destroy his entire career? The answer would shake the foundations of everything Bradley thought he knew about power, privilege, and justice. The house at 1247 Maple Street had been Marcus Williams' sanctuary for the past 3 years, ever since he'd moved to Detroit to be closer to his aging mother. The walls were lined with commendations, photos from police academy graduations, and community service awards. A 20-year career dedicated to justice, displayed for all to see. But Officer Bradley's eyes were too clouded by prejudice to notice any of it. Marcus had grown up understanding the delicate balance of being a black man in America, especially one in law enforcement. His father, Robert Williams, had been a civil rights activist in the 1960s, while his mother, Dorothy, had worked as a nurse in some of Chicago's toughest neighborhoods. They had taught him that respect was earned, not given, and that true strength came from standing up for what was right, even when the odds were stacked against you. Springfield, Illinois, where Marcus served as police chief, was a city of 110,000 people, struggling with the same issues that plagued many American cities: budget cuts, rising crime rates, and a growing divide between law enforcement and the communities they served. Marcus had spent the last 5 years rebuilding trust, implementing community policing programs, and rooting out the kind of corruption that now stood in his living room wearing a Detroit police uniform. Officer Daniel Bradley, 38, had been with the Detroit Police for 12 years, and in that time had accumulated 17 complaints for excessive force and discriminatory behavior. None had stuck, partly due to the blue wall of silence, and partly because Bradley was smart enough to target people who wouldn't be believed over a white police officer. He lived in a world where his badge was a license to intimidate, where his uniform commanded unquestioned respect, and where people like Marcus Williams were supposed to know their place. Bradley's partner, Officer James Reynolds, was a different story entirely. At 29, he was relatively new to the force, having joined the Detroit Police just 4 years ago after completing his criminal justice degree at Wayne State University. Reynolds had grown up in a diverse neighborhood and had always believed in the ideal of police officers as protectors and servants of the community. But 4 years of watching officers like Bradley operate with impunity had slowly eroded his faith in the system. The Detroit Police Department in 2023 was an organization in crisis. Years of budget cuts, political pressure, and high-profile misconduct cases had left the force understaffed and demoralized. Corruption had become institutionalized, with officers like Bradley knowing they could act with virtual impunity as long as they kept their activities to certain neighborhoods and targeted the right people. What made this particular morning so explosive was the convergence of two very different police cultures. Springfield's department, under Marcus's leadership, had become a model for progressive policing, emphasizing de-escalation, community engagement, and zero tolerance for corruption. Detroit's department, despite reform efforts, still harbored pockets of the old guard mentality that Bradley represented. As Marcus stood in his living room, watching Bradley's theatrical discovery of planted evidence, he felt the weight of every young black man who had been in this exact situation without the power to fight back. He thought of Jamal Thompson, a 19-year-old college student from Springfield, who had been falsely arrested 6 months ago by a corrupt officer who was now serving time thanks to Marcus's investigation. He thought of his own nephew, David, who, despite being an honor student at Northwestern University, still called Marcus every time he was pulled over, terrified that one wrong move could end his life. The irony wasn't lost on Marcus that he was experiencing firsthand the very corruption he'd spent his career fighting. But what Bradley didn't understand was that Marcus Williams wasn't just another victim. He was a man who had dedicated his life to justice, who had the resources and knowledge to fight back, and who had nothing left to lose. Reynolds watched the scene unfold with growing horror. He had heard the rumors about Bradley, had seen the subtle signs of corruption, but had never witnessed it this blatantly. The nervous young officer found himself at a crossroads: remain silent and become complicit in a serious crime, or find the courage to do what his oath had sworn him to do. The rain continued to pound against the windows as 3 men stood in that living room, each representing different aspects of American law enforcement. Bradley embodied the worst of the old system: racist, corrupt, and drunk on unchecked power. Reynolds represented the conflicted middle ground, officers who knew right from wrong but struggled to act on it within a corrupt system. And Marcus Williams stood for what policing could be: principled, just, and accountable. In the next few moments, this chance encounter would set in motion events that would expose a network of corruption reaching far beyond one racist cop, ultimately leading to the largest police corruption investigation in Detroit's history. The plastic bag of cocaine sat on Marcus's coffee table like a venomous snake, its presence poisoning the air in the room. Bradley stood over it with the satisfaction of a predator who had just trapped his prey, completely unaware that he had just walked into the den of a much more dangerous animal. James Reynolds, badge number 4429, Marcus said calmly, his eyes fixed on the nervous younger officer. I'm going to ask you a direct question, and I want you to think very carefully before you answer. Did you witness your partner plant that evidence? Reynolds felt his mouth go dry. The question hung in the air like a challenge, and he could feel Bradley's cold stare boring into him. In that moment, everything his police academy instructors had taught him about integrity and honor seemed to clash violently with the reality of what it meant to survive in a corrupt department. Reynolds stammered, his loyalty to his partner warring with his conscience. "Shut up, Reynolds," Bradley snapped, his facade of professional conduct finally cracking. "Don't listen to this piece of trash. He's obviously a drug dealer trying to talk his way out of a legitimate arrest." Marcus reached slowly into his jacket pocket, his movements deliberate and controlled. Bradley's hand instinctively moved toward his weapon, but Marcus's calm demeanor gave him pause. What Marcus pulled out wasn't a gun or drugs. It was a leather wallet that he opened with methodical precision. "Detective Daniel Bradley," Marcus said, reading from a small notebook he'd pulled from the wallet. "Badge number 2847, 12 years with Detroit PD, 17 excessive force complaints, 3 pending internal investigations, currently under federal surveillance for suspected drug trafficking and evidence tampering." The color drained from Bradley's face. "How the hell do you—" "Because, Detective Bradley," Marcus interrupted, his voice taking on an authority that filled the room, "I'm Police Chief Marcus Williams of Springfield, Illinois, and you just made the mistake of trying to frame a fellow law enforcement officer who's been investigating dirty cops like you for the past 5 years. Marcus pulled out his official police identification, holding it up so both officers could see it clearly. The gold badge gleamed under the living room lights, and the weight of his authority settled over the room like a heavy blanket. Reynolds felt his knees go weak. Everything suddenly made sense. The confidence, the calm demeanor, the way Marcus had been recording everything. He wasn't just witnessing a corrupt arrest, he was watching his partner commit career suicide in real time. Bradley's mind raced as he tried to process this new information. A police chief. Not just any cop, but a chief who obviously had connections and resources far beyond anything Bradley had anticipated. The planted evidence that had seemed like such a clever move moments ago now felt like a noose tightening around his neck. "You're lying," Bradley said, but his voice lacked conviction. "This is some kind of setup." Marcus walked over to a framed photograph on his mantelpiece, a picture of him shaking hands with the governor of Illinois at a police reform conference. Next to it was another photo showing Marcus receiving a commendation from the FBI for his work on a multi-state corruption investigation. 3 months ago, Marcus said, his voice steady and authoritative, "I testified before a congressional committee about police corruption in American cities. Detroit was specifically mentioned in my report as a department with systemic problems that required federal intervention. Your name, Detective Bradley, was in that report." The room fell silent, except for the sound of Reynolds' rapid breathing. The young officer realized he was witnessing something unprecedented, a corrupt cop being caught in the act by someone with the power to actually do something about it. Bradley's survival instincts kicked in. He had 2 choices: try to bluff his way out of this disaster, or cut his losses and run. His hand moved toward the planted evidence, perhaps thinking he could somehow retrieve it and claim the whole thing had been a misunderstanding. "I wouldn't touch that if I were you," Marcus warned. "Everything that's happened here has been recorded and transmitted to both the Springfield Police Department and the FBI's Detroit field office. They've been monitoring my home security system since I moved here." Marcus gestured toward several small cameras positioned strategically around the room, devices that Bradley had been too arrogant to notice when he'd forced his way into the house. "You see, Detective Bradley, when you're a police chief investigating corruption, you learn to protect yourself. Every conversation, every interaction, every moment is documented. What you've done here today isn't just attempted evidence planting. It's federal civil rights violation, conspiracy, and about 6 other felonies that will ensure you spend the next 20 years in federal prison." Reynolds found his voice at last. "Chief Williams, I didn't know. I swear I had no idea what he was planning." Marcus studied the young officer carefully. "Officer Reynolds, you have approximately 30 seconds to decide whether you're going to be part of the problem or part of the solution. Choose wisely, because what happens next will define the rest of your career." The sound of approaching sirens began to fill the air, growing louder by the second. The sirens grew louder as 3 black SUVs pulled up to Marcus's house, followed by 2 Detroit police patrol cars. Through the window, Marcus could see FBI agents in their distinctive windbreakers stepping out into the rain. along with several high-ranking Detroit police officials whose faces he recognized from news reports. "Chief Williams," Reynolds said urgently, his voice cracking with desperation, "I need you to know that this isn't the first time. Bradley has been doing this for months, maybe longer. There are others involved. Sergeants, detectives, even some captains." Bradley spun around, his face contorted with rage. "You little rat, you don't know what you're talking about." "I know about the warehouse on Jefferson Avenue," Reynolds continued, his words tumbling out in a rush. "I know about Detective Morrison and Sergeant Collins. I know about the evidence room tampering and the protection money from the drug dealers on the east side." Marcus felt a cold chill run down his spine. What had started as a simple case of a racist cop planting evidence was revealing itself to be something much larger, a conspiracy that could potentially reach into the highest levels of the Detroit Police Department. The front door opened, and Special Agent Sarah Chen of the FBI's Detroit field office stepped inside, followed by Deputy Chief Robert Jackson of the Detroit Police. Marcus had worked with Chen before on a joint task force investigating police corruption in the Midwest, and her presence here meant that the federal government was taking this situation very seriously. "Chief Williams," Agent Chen said with a professional nod, "we got your signal 20 minutes ago. I take it our friend Detective Bradley here decided to make our job easier." Bradley looked around the room wildly, his eyes darting between the FBI agent, the deputy chief, and the incriminating evidence still sitting on Marcus's coffee table. The reality of his situation was beginning to sink in. He had been caught red-handed by people who had the power to destroy not just his career, but his entire life. "This is all a setup," Bradley shouted. "Williams planted that evidence himself. He's trying to frame me." Deputy Chief Jackson stepped forward, his expression grim. "Detective Bradley, you're suspended immediately pending a full investigation. You will surrender your weapon and badge to Agent Chen." "You can't do this to me," Bradley snarled. "I've got 20 years on this job. I know where all the bodies are buried." The threat hung in the air like a loaded weapon. Marcus exchanged glances with Agent Chen, both of them recognizing the significance of Bradley's words. Corrupt cops who felt cornered often became valuable sources of information about larger criminal networks. Agent Chen moved closer to Bradley, her voice taking on the practiced tone of an experienced interrogator. "Detective Bradley, it sounds like you might have information that could be valuable to our ongoing investigations. If you're interested in cooperation, now would be the time to consider your options." Meanwhile, Reynolds stood frozen by the window, watching more federal agents setting up a mobile command center in the street. The magnitude of what was happening was overwhelming him. His decision to speak up about Bradley's corruption had apparently triggered something much larger than he had ever imagined. Marcus's phone buzzed with an encrypted message from his own department in Springfield. The text was brief but alarming. 3 more Detroit officers identified in evidence tampering network. Federal warrants being issued now. Stay safe. The corruption investigation that Marcus had been quietly working on for months was suddenly accelerating beyond anyone's expectations. What had started as reports of suspicious arrest patterns in Detroit had led to a joint FBI Springfield police task force, and now Bradley's arrogant attempt to frame Marcus had provided the final piece of evidence needed to bring down what appeared to be a multi-million-dollar criminal enterprise operating within the Detroit Police Department. "Officer Reynolds," Deputy Chief Jackson said, his voice carrying the weight of authority, "you're going to need to come with us for a full debriefing. Your cooperation could be crucial in identifying other officers involved in this conspiracy." Reynolds nodded, his face pale but resolute. "Yes, sir. I want to do the right thing. I should have spoken up months ago." As the law enforcement officials began coordinating their response, Marcus noticed a black sedan with tinted windows parked across the street that hadn't been there before. 2 men in expensive suits sat in the front seats, watching the scene unfold with obvious interest. Their presence sent another chill through Marcus. Corruption cases often attracted the attention of the very criminal organizations that had been paying for police protection. Agent Chen followed Marcus's gaze and immediately spoke into her radio. "Control, we have possible hostile surveillance at the scene, requesting additional security protocols." The rain continued to fall as the investigation expanded beyond the walls of Marcus's home. What had begun as a single corrupt cop's racist attack was now revealing itself to be part of a criminal network that could potentially implicate dozens of officers and criminals throughout the Detroit metropolitan area. Bradley sat handcuffed on Marcus's couch, his earlier arrogance replaced by the dawning realization that his life as he knew it was over. But more than that, he was beginning to understand that he had accidentally triggered an investigation that would expose secrets some very dangerous people had killed to protect. The mobile command center hummed with activity as Agent Chen coordinated with multiple law enforcement agencies across 3 states. What had started as a routine corruption investigation was rapidly evolving into something unprecedented. Marcus stood beside the command vehicle, watching as FBI technicians analyzed the evidence from his living room while monitoring communications across the Detroit Police Department's radio frequencies. "Chief Williams," Agent Chen said, approaching with a tablet in her hands, "we need to talk privately. What Reynolds told us about the warehouse on Jefferson Avenue just opened up a connection we never expected." They moved away from the crowd of officers and agents, finding shelter under Marcus's garage overhang. The rain had intensified, and the autumn wind carried with it the promise of an early winter. "The warehouse Reynolds mentioned," Chen continued. "It's owned by a shell company that we've been tracking for 8 months. It's connected to the Castellano crime family out of Chicago, specifically to Vincent Castellano Jr., who's been trying to expand his drug trafficking operations into Detroit." Marcus felt his blood run cold. He knew that name all too well. 6 months ago, in Springfield, he had arrested Vincent Castellano Jr.'s lieutenant, Tony Marconi, for running a drug operation through corrupted police evidence rooms. Marconi was currently in federal custody, awaiting trial, and his arrest had been the breakthrough that led to the larger investigation of police corruption in the Midwest. "Chen," Marcus said slowly, "I think Bradley just stumbled into something much bigger than either of us realized. The Castellano connection isn't coincidental." Before Chen could respond, her radio crackled to life with an urgent message. "Agent Chen, we have a problem. Detective Bradley is asking to speak with you immediately. He says he has information about a planned hit on Police Chief Williams." The words hit Marcus like a physical blow. A planned hit. On him. The pieces of the puzzle were falling into place with terrifying clarity. His investigation in Springfield hadn't just exposed local corruption, it had threatened a multi-state criminal operation worth millions of dollars. They rushed back to the command vehicle, where Bradley sat in the back of an FBI van, no longer the arrogant racist cop who had invaded Marcus's home. His face was pale, his hands shaking, and his eyes darted nervously between the agents surrounding him. "Bradley," Agent Chen said, sliding into the seat across from him, "what do you know about a hit on Chief Williams?" Bradley's voice was barely above a whisper. "I wasn't supposed to plant evidence on him specifically. I got a call this morning from Sergeant Collins. He told me there was a drug dealer at 1247 Maple Street who needed to be taken care of. He said it was a high-priority target, someone who was causing problems for our benefactors." Marcus leaned forward. "You're saying someone in your department specifically targeted me?" "I didn't know who you were," Bradley protested. "Collins just gave me the address and told me to make sure whoever lived there got arrested on serious charges. He said if the arrest didn't stick, there were other people who would handle the problem permanently." Agent Chen and Marcus exchanged grim looks. The implications were staggering. Someone within the Detroit Police Department had identified Marcus as a threat and had arranged for him to be neutralized, first through false arrest, and if that failed, through assassination. "Who else knows about this order?" Chen demanded. "I don't know. Collins handles all the communications with the outside people, but there are at least 6 other detectives involved in the protection scheme, maybe more." Marcus's phone rang, displaying his mother's number. His heart sank as he realized that if the criminal organization knew where he lived, they might also know about his family. "Mom?" he answered, trying to keep his voice calm. "Marcus, honey, there are some strange men in a car outside my apartment building. They've been there for about an hour just sitting and watching. Should I be worried?" The blood drained from Marcus's face. "Mom, listen to me very carefully. Go to your neighbor Mrs. Patterson's apartment right now. Don't pack anything, don't look out the window, just go there immediately. I'm sending police officers to get you." Agent Chen was already on her radio, dispatching federal agents to Marcus's mother's location. The scope of the threat was expanding by the minute. "Bradley," Marcus said, his voice deadly serious, "if anything happens to my mother, I will make sure you spend the rest of your life in solitary confinement. Who else might they target?" Bradley's face crumpled. "Anyone connected to you, family, friends, colleagues. The Castellanos don't leave loose ends." Marcus felt a rage building inside him that was different from anything he'd ever experienced. This had gone far beyond police corruption or even personal revenge. A criminal organization was threatening innocent people simply because Marcus had done his job and upheld his oath to protect and serve. Agent Chen stepped outside to coordinate the expanding investigation, leaving Marcus alone with Bradley. The corrupt cop looked up at him with something approaching fear. "Chief Williams," Bradley said quietly, "I know you have no reason to believe me, but I never signed up for this. It started small, just looking the other way sometimes, maybe losing some evidence. I never thought it would lead to targeting other cops or threatening families." Marcus stared at the broken man before him, seeing not just corruption, but the gradual erosion of everything law enforcement was supposed to represent. The next 2 hours transformed Marcus's quiet neighborhood into the epicenter of the largest police corruption investigation in Detroit's history. FBI agents secured his mother from her apartment building, confirming that she had indeed been under surveillance by unknown individuals who fled when federal agents arrived. The black sedan that had been watching Marcus's house was traced to a rental company with ties to known Castellano associates. Deputy Chief Jackson stood in Marcus's kitchen, his face grave as he reviewed reports streaming in from across the city. "Chief Williams, I owe you an apology. What Detective Bradley attempted here today has exposed a level of corruption in my department that frankly makes me sick to my stomach." Marcus accepted the coffee that Agent Chen offered him, his hands still shaking slightly from the adrenaline of learning about the threat to his family. "Deputy Chief, this isn't about apologies. This is about how deep this goes, and how many more officers might be compromised." Through the window, they could see Officer Reynolds being interviewed by federal agents near the command vehicle. The young officer had provided them with names, dates, and locations that were already generating search warrants across 3 states. His decision to speak up had transformed him from a potential accomplice into the key witness in a federal racketeering case. Agent Chen's tablet chimed with an urgent notification. "We just received intelligence from Chicago. Vincent Castellano Jr. was arrested 20 minutes ago trying to board a private jet to Mexico. It appears the entire organization is attempting to flee the country." The domino effect was remarkable to witness. Bradley's racist attack on Marcus had triggered a series of events that were now bringing down a criminal network that had been operating with impunity for years. The irony wasn't lost on Marcus that Bradley's prejudice and arrogance had ultimately destroyed the very system that had protected him. Marcus's phone buzzed with a call from Springfield. It was his deputy chief, Maria Santos. "Marcus, thank God you're safe. We've been monitoring the FBI communications, and this is bigger than anything we imagined. The Castellano connection explains why our evidence room break-in last month was so sophisticated. They weren't just stealing drugs, they were accessing information about ongoing investigations." "Maria," Marcus replied, "I need you to put the entire department on high alert. If they were willing to target me, they might go after other officers involved in the investigation." While Marcus coordinated with his own department, Agent Chen was receiving updates that painted an increasingly complex picture of the criminal organization's reach. The warehouse that Reynolds had mentioned was raided simultaneously with 6 other locations across Detroit, revealing a sophisticated operation that involved not just drug trafficking, but also weapons smuggling, money laundering, and human trafficking. Detective Bradley, now fully cooperating with federal investigators, was providing a detailed account of how the corruption had started and spread throughout the Detroit Police Department. What had begun as small favors for criminal associates had gradually evolved into a protection racket that generated millions of dollars in illegal revenue. The scariest part, Agent Chen confided to Marcus as they watched the investigation unfold, is how systematic it became. They had protocols for everything, which evidence to lose, which arrests to sabotage, which investigations to redirect. It was corruption as a business model. Deputy Chief Jackson received a radio call that made his face pale. "We have a problem. Sergeant Collins, the one Bradley mentioned as his contact, he's missing. His wife says he left for work this morning but never arrived at the precinct. His patrol car was found abandoned near the Canadian border." The implications were clear. As news of the federal investigation spread through the compromised network, officers involved in the conspiracy were either fleeing or potentially being silenced by their criminal partners. The Castellano organization had a reputation for eliminating loose ends, and corrupt police officers who could testify against them definitely qualified as loose ends. Marcus looked around his living room, which had been transformed into a crime scene with evidence markers and forensic photographers documenting every detail. The violation he felt went beyond the physical invasion of his home. It was the betrayal of everything he believed about law enforcement and justice. "Chief Williams," Reynolds approached hesitantly, his young face etched with guilt and determination. "I know I can't undo what I allowed to happen, but I want you to know that I'm prepared to testify against every officer I know to be involved in this conspiracy. It's going to end my career in Detroit, but maybe I can find a way to be a real police officer somewhere else." Marcus studied the young man's face, seeing in him the same idealism that had driven Marcus to become a police officer 20 years ago. "Officer Reynolds, doing the right thing often comes with a cost. But integrity isn't about avoiding consequences. It's about being willing to pay the price for your principles." As the sun began to set through the storm clouds, the true scope of what they had uncovered was becoming clear. This wasn't just about one racist cop or even a corrupt police department. It was about a criminal organization that had systematically corrupted law enforcement to protect a multi-million-dollar illegal empire. 3 weeks after the raid on his home, Marcus Williams stood before a joint congressional committee in Washington, D.C., his testimony being broadcast live across the nation. The corruption scandal that had begun with Bradley's racist attack had evolved into a federal case involving 43 police officers, 12 civilians, and criminal charges spanning 5 states. "Honorable members of Congress," Marcus began, his voice steady and authoritative, "what happened in my living room on October 15th was not an isolated incident of police misconduct. It was the symptom of a systemic disease that has infected law enforcement agencies across our nation." The committee room was packed with journalists, law enforcement officials, and civil rights advocates. Marcus had spent weeks preparing for this moment, knowing that his testimony could influence police reform legislation for years to come. But more than that, he understood that he had become a symbol, a black police chief who had stood up to corruption and won. Behind him in the gallery sat Officer James Reynolds, who had resigned from the Detroit Police Department and was now enrolled in law school, determined to fight corruption from within the legal system. His decision to testify against his former colleagues had cost him his career but had saved his integrity. "The network we uncovered," Marcus continued, "had developed a sophistication that rivaled any criminal organization. They had infiltrated evidence rooms, corrupted investigation procedures, and created a protection racket that generated over $12 million in illegal revenue annually." Agent Chen, now leading a newly created FBI task force on police corruption, sat in the front row taking notes. The Detroit investigation had become a model for federal intervention in corrupt police departments, and Chen's expertise was in high demand across the country. The past 3 weeks had transformed Marcus from a small city police chief into a national figure in the fight against police corruption. He had received death threats, which required federal protection for both him and his mother. But he had also received thousands of letters of support from police officers across the country who were tired of seeing their profession tainted by corrupt colleagues. "Detective Bradley's attempt to frame me," Marcus testified, "was ordered by Sergeant Harold Collins, who has since fled to Mexico and is currently fighting extradition. Collins was receiving approximately $50,000 per month to ensure that certain arrests never led to convictions and that certain evidence never made it to trial." The congressman from Michigan leaned forward. "Chief Williams, in your professional opinion, how widespread is this type of corruption in American police departments?" Marcus paused, choosing his words carefully. "Congressman, I believe that the vast majority of police officers are honest, dedicated public servants. But the corruption we uncovered in Detroit exists because good officers remained silent when they witnessed misconduct. The blue wall of silence doesn't just protect corrupt cops, it enables them to recruit others and expand their operations." Back in Springfield, Marcus's own department had implemented new transparency measures that were being studied by police departments nationwide. Body cameras were now mandatory for all officers, evidence room access was monitored by independent auditors, and a civilian oversight board reviewed all arrests involving minority suspects. "Chief Williams," the committee chairwoman asked, "what changes do you believe are necessary to prevent this type of corruption from taking root in other departments?" Madam Chairwoman, corruption thrives in darkness. We need mandatory federal oversight of police departments with histories of misconduct complaints. We need independent prosecutors for cases involving police officers. And we need to end the qualified immunity doctrine that protects officers from civil liability when they violate citizens' constitutional rights. The hearing room erupted in applause from civil rights advocates, while law enforcement representatives shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Marcus knew that his recommendations would face fierce opposition from police unions and conservative politicians, but he also knew that meaningful reform required uncomfortable conversations. After the hearing, Marcus met privately with the Attorney General, who had requested a confidential briefing on the ongoing investigation. They sat in a secure conference room in the Department of Justice, reviewing classified intelligence about the Castellano organization's efforts to corrupt law enforcement in other cities. Chief Williams, the Attorney General said, "We have credible intelligence that the Castellano organization had corrupted police departments in at least 8 other cities. Your investigation may have exposed the tip of a very large iceberg." Marcus nodded grimly. "Madam Attorney General, organized crime has always sought to corrupt law enforcement. What's different now is the sophistication of their methods and the scale of their operations. They're not just bribing individual officers, they're systematically infiltrating entire departments." The Attorney General slid a classified folder across the table. "We want to offer you a position as Special Advisor on Police Corruption. You would work directly with the FBI to identify and investigate corrupt police departments nationwide. It would mean leaving Springfield, but it would also mean leading the fight against corruption on a national level." Marcus stared at the folder, understanding that accepting this position would fundamentally change his life. He would become a target for corrupt officers and criminal organizations across the country. But he would also have the resources and authority to make real change in American law enforcement. "How long do I have to decide?" Marcus asked. "Take your time, Chief, but know that what started in your living room has the potential to transform policing in America. You've proven that one person with integrity can bring down an entire criminal network. Imagine what you could accomplish with federal resources behind you." 6 months later, Marcus Williams had traded his quiet office in Springfield for a bustling federal facility in Quantico, Virginia. As Special Advisor on Police Corruption, he now oversaw investigations into compromised police departments across 12 states. The success of the Detroit operation had led to similar investigations in Cleveland, Baltimore, and Phoenix, uncovering a web of corruption that stretched from coast to coast. But success had come with a price. The threats against Marcus and his family had escalated to the point where his mother had been relocated to a secure federal facility, and Marcus himself lived under constant federal protection. The Castellano organization, despite the arrest of its leadership, continued to operate through affiliated crime families who viewed Marcus as their primary threat. Agent Chen entered Marcus's office carrying a thick file marked "Classified, Eyes Only." Her expression was grim as she closed the door behind her and activated the room's electronic security measures. "Marcus, we have a problem," she said, opening the file to reveal surveillance photographs and intercepted communications. "Intelligence indicates that the Torelli crime family from New York has put a $2 million contract on your life. They're calling it insurance against future federal investigations." Marcus studied the photographs, which showed known assassins meeting with corrupt police officers in 3 different cities. The sophistication of the threat was unlike anything he had faced before. These weren't desperate criminals acting impulsively, but a coordinated effort by organized crime to eliminate the federal government's most effective weapon against police corruption. "How reliable is this intelligence?" Marcus asked, though he could already see the answer in Chen's expression. "Rock solid. We have audio recordings of the meetings and financial transfers through offshore accounts. They're not just planning to kill you, Marcus. They're planning to make it look like it was done by dirty cops seeking revenge. They want to discredit everything you've accomplished." The irony was bitter. Marcus had spent his career fighting to reform law enforcement, and now criminal organizations were planning to use corrupt police officers to murder him while framing the very institution he had dedicated his life to serving. Marcus's secure phone rang with a call from Springfield. It was his replacement as Police Chief David Martinez, who had been implementing the transparency reforms that Marcus had designed. "Marcus, we have a situation here. 3 of our officers have been approached by individuals claiming to represent federal investigators. They're asking detailed questions about your personal habits, family members, and security protocols. Something doesn't feel right about it. Marcus felt his blood run cold. The criminal organization wasn't just planning to attack him directly. They were gathering intelligence about everyone connected to him, potentially preparing to target his former colleagues and friends as either victims or unwitting accomplices. David, put the entire department on high alert immediately. Contact Agent Chen's office for verification of any federal investigators who approach your people. And whatever you do, don't let anyone know about this conversation. After ending the call, Marcus turned to Chen with growing urgency. They're not just targeting me. They're mapping my entire network. Everyone I've worked with. Everyone who might continue my work if I'm eliminated. Chen nodded grimly. We've identified similar reconnaissance activities in Detroit, Phoenix, and Baltimore. They're preparing for what our analysts are calling a decapitation strike. Eliminate the key figures in the federal anti-corruption effort and hope it collapses the entire program. The weight of responsibility settled heavily on Marcus's shoulders. What had started as a single racist cop's attack on him had evolved into a nationwide battle between federal law enforcement and organized crime. Dozens of honest police officers who had spoken out against corruption were now potentially at risk because they had followed his example. Marcus walked to his office window, which overlooked the FBI training academy, where new agents learned the skills they would need to fight crime and corruption. In the distance, he could see young recruits practicing tactical exercises, their faces filled with the same idealism that had driven him to become a police officer 20 years ago. Chen, Marcus said, turning back to face her, I want you to set up a meeting with the Attorney General and the FBI Director. If organized crime wants to make this personal, then we need to make our response equally personal. What are you thinking? Marcus's expression hardened with determination. I'm thinking that we stop playing defense and start playing offense. These criminal organizations have declared war on federal law enforcement, and it's time we showed them what that really means. Over the next 48 hours, Marcus worked with federal prosecutors to develop what they called Operation Clean Badge, a coordinated nationwide effort to arrest every known associate of the corruption network simultaneously. Rather than wait for the criminals to strike first, they would eliminate the entire organization in a single, overwhelming assault. The operation would require coordination between the FBI, DEA, ATF, and local police departments in 15 states. It would be the largest anti-corruption operation in American history, and its success or failure would determine whether organized crime could successfully intimidate federal law enforcement into backing down. But Marcus knew that even if Operation Clean Badge succeeded, he would remain a target. The criminal organizations had invested too much money and effort in their corruption networks to simply accept their destruction. They would keep coming for him until either he was dead or they were completely destroyed. As he reviewed the operational plans, Marcus thought about Officer Reynolds, now in his second year of law school, and the hundreds of honest police officers who had found the courage to speak out against corruption because of what had happened in his living room. Their safety depended on his ability to not just survive the coming battle, but to win it decisively. The stage was set for a confrontation that would determine the future of American law enforcement and the rule of law itself. At 4:47 a.m. on a cold February morning, Operation Clean Badge launched simultaneously across 15 states. FBI tactical teams, supported by federal marshals and honest local police officers, executed arrest warrants on 127 individuals connected to the corruption network. Marcus Williams coordinated the operation from the FBI's Strategic Operations Center in Quantico, watching as months of careful investigation culminated in the largest anti-corruption sweep in American history. Phoenix team reporting successful arrest of Captain Rodriguez and 5 associates came the first report over the radio. Baltimore team has secured the evidence warehouse and arrested all suspects on site, followed another. But Marcus knew that the real test would come in Detroit, where the corruption had run deepest and where the criminal organization had the strongest connections. Agent Chen led the Detroit operation personally, targeting not just the remaining corrupt officers, but also the civilian criminal network that had been paying for police protection. Detroit team to Operations Center, Chen's voice crackled over the secure radio. We have a problem. Someone tipped off the targets. 3 of our primary suspects have fled, and we found evidence that they were warned about the operation. Marcus felt his stomach drop. A leak in the operation meant that there were still corrupt elements within law enforcement that they hadn't identified. More than that, it meant that the criminal organization knew exactly what the federal government was doing and could plan accordingly. Chen, pull your team back and establish a security perimeter. We may have walked into a trap. Even as Marcus spoke, alarms began sounding throughout the operations center. Intelligence analysts monitoring communications intercepts had detected multiple conversations, indicating that criminal associates were moving to implement their contingency plans, including the contract on Marcus's life. Sir, we're tracking 3 separate teams of suspected assassins converging on the Quantico area, reported the intelligence coordinator. They appear to be using stolen law enforcement credentials to bypass security checkpoints. The battle that Marcus had anticipated was no longer theoretical. It was happening in real time, with professional killers attempting to infiltrate one of the most secure federal facilities in the country. But what the criminal organization didn't understand was that Marcus Williams was no longer just a police chief who had stumbled onto their conspiracy. He was now the tip of the spear of federal law enforcement's response to organized crime. Activate Condition Alpha security protocols, Marcus ordered, his voice calm despite the chaos surrounding him. All non-essential personnel to secure areas, tactical response teams to defensive positions. Through the operations center's windows, Marcus could see federal agents taking positions throughout the facility. In the distance, military helicopters from nearby Marine Corps base Quantico were approaching to provide additional security. The criminal organization had made a critical error. They had chosen to attack the heart of federal law enforcement on its own territory. Agent Chen's voice came over the radio with an urgent update. Marcus, we've intercepted communications indicating that this isn't just about killing you. They're planning to make it look like a terrorist attack on federal law enforcement. They want to discredit the entire anti-corruption program by making it appear that federal agents are the real threat to public safety. The sophistication of the plan was breathtaking in its audacity. By framing the assassination as a terrorist attack, the criminal organization hoped to create public distrust of federal law enforcement while eliminating their most effective opponent. It was a strategy that could potentially set back police reform efforts by decades. Marcus made a decision that would define the rest of his career. Instead of remaining in the secure operations center, he walked out into the main corridor of the federal facility, making himself visible to anyone who might be watching. If the criminal organization wanted him dead, they would have to come for him directly without hiding behind false narratives or innocent victims. Marcus, what the hell are you doing? Chen's voice called out over his radio. I'm ending this, Marcus replied, walking toward the facility's main entrance. They want to make this about terrorism and public safety. Let them try to explain why professional assassins are attacking a federal law enforcement facility. Security cameras throughout the facility tracked Marcus's movement as he positioned himself in the main lobby, surrounded by federal agents but clearly visible to anyone attempting to infiltrate the building. Within minutes, intelligence intercepts confirmed that the assassins had identified his location and were adjusting their approach. All units, suspects are moving toward the main entrance, the tactical coordinator announced. We have eyes on 3 individuals with suspected explosive devices. But as the first assassin approached the facility's security checkpoint, something unexpected happened. Officer James Reynolds, the young Detroit cop who had testified against his corrupt colleagues, appeared on the security monitors. He was in the parking lot, having driven through the night from law school to warn Marcus about intelligence he had received from sources still within the Detroit Police Department. Reynolds, get out of there, Marcus shouted into his radio, but it was too late. The assassins had spotted Reynolds and recognized him as a witness against their organization. In their desperation to complete their mission, they had just made their final mistake, attacking a law student and former police officer in full view of federal security cameras and dozens of witnesses. The battle for the future of American law enforcement was about to be decided in the next 60 seconds. The gunfire lasted exactly 47 seconds. When the smoke cleared in the Quantico parking lot, all 3 assassins lay dead, their weapons and fake federal credentials scattered around them. Officer Reynolds had survived with minor injuries, protected by the bulletproof vest that Marcus had insisted all testifying witnesses wear. The The entire attack had been captured on high-definition security cameras, providing irrefutable evidence of organized crime's assault on federal law enforcement. 6 months later, Marcus Williams stood once again before a congressional committee, but this time the atmosphere was dramatically different. The failed assassination attempt had galvanized public opinion in favor of police reform and federal anti-corruption efforts. The criminal organization's plan to discredit federal law enforcement had backfired spectacularly, instead providing the political momentum needed to pass the most comprehensive police reform legislation in American history. The Federal Police Accountability Act, Marcus testified, represents a fundamental shift in how we approach law enforcement oversight in America. Mandatory federal monitoring of police departments with excessive force complaints, independent prosecutors for police misconduct cases, and the end of qualified immunity for constitutional violations. The legislation had passed with bipartisan support, something that would have been impossible before the assassination attempt. The sight of professional killers attacking a federal facility while attempting to murder a police chief who fought corruption had shocked even the most conservative members of Congress into action. In the gallery behind, Marcus sat a remarkable collection of people whose lives had been changed by the events that began in his living room. Officer Reynolds, now in his final year of law school, had been accepted to the FBI Academy and would graduate as a federal agent specializing in police corruption investigations. Agent Chen had been promoted to assistant director of the FBI's new Police Integrity Division, overseeing anti-corruption efforts nationwide. Even Detective Bradley, now serving a 15-year federal sentence, had become an unlikely ally in the fight against corruption. His detailed testimony about the inner workings of corrupt police departments had led to reforms in evidence handling and oversight procedures that were being implemented across the country. The Castellano and Torelli crime families had been effectively destroyed as functioning organizations. Over 200 individuals had been convicted on federal charges ranging from racketeering to attempted murder of federal officials. The assassination attempt had provided prosecutors with the evidence they needed to invoke federal terrorism statutes, resulting in life sentences for the surviving leadership. But perhaps the most significant change was in the culture of law enforcement itself. The blue wall of silence that had protected corrupt officers for generations was beginning to crack. Young officers across the country were speaking out against misconduct, inspired by Marcus's example, and protected by new federal whistleblower statutes. Chief Williams, the committee chairwoman asked, "What would you say to police officers who are afraid to report corruption in their own departments?" Marcus looked directly into the television cameras, knowing that his words would reach police officers in departments across the nation. "I would tell them that silence in the face of corruption makes you complicit in that corruption. I would tell them that their oath to protect and serve means protecting the public from bad cops as well as criminals. And I would tell them that they are not alone. There are federal resources and protections available to officers who have the courage to do the right thing." After the hearing, Marcus returned to his office at Quantico, where a new case file waited on his desk. Reports of corruption in the Los Angeles Police Department with potential connections to Mexican drug cartels. The work continued, but now it was being done with unprecedented federal resources and public support. His mother, now living safely in a secure federal retirement community, called him every evening to check on his progress. She had become something of a celebrity among the other residents, proud of her son's role in transforming American law enforcement. "Marcus," she said during their nightly conversation, "your father would be so proud of what you've accomplished. He always said that one person with courage could change the world." Marcus smiled, looking out his office window at the FBI Academy, where new agents were training to fight corruption and uphold justice. The racist cop who had tried to frame him in his own living room had inadvertently triggered a revolution in American policing. Sometimes, Marcus reflected, justice worked in mysterious ways. The fight against corruption would never be completely won, but for the first time in his career, Marcus Williams believed that honest cops were winning. 5 years after Detective Bradley planted evidence in Marcus Williams' living room, the landscape of American law enforcement had been fundamentally transformed. The Federal Police Accountability Act had created a new era of transparency and oversight that corrupt officers could no longer hide behind. Marcus Williams, now serving his second term as director of the Federal Police Integrity Division, oversaw a department of 500 agents dedicated exclusively to investigating police corruption. The unit had successfully prosecuted corrupt officers in 47 states and had become a model for international law enforcement agencies dealing with similar challenges. Officer James Reynolds had graduated from both law school and the FBI Academy, specializing in organized crime infiltration of law enforcement. He now led a team of young agents who had been inspired by his courage to speak out against corruption. The former Detroit cop had become one of the Bureau's most effective investigators, using his insider knowledge of police culture to identify and dismantle corrupt networks before they could fully establish themselves. Agent Sarah Chen had been appointed as the FBI's deputy director, overseeing all domestic law enforcement coordination. Her experience with the Detroit corruption case had made her a leading expert on the intersection between organized crime and police corruption, and she frequently testified before international law enforcement conferences about American anti-corruption strategies. The Detroit Police Department, once synonymous with corruption and misconduct, had become a model for police reform. Under new leadership and federal oversight, the department had implemented community policing programs that had reduced both crime rates and complaints against officers. Young recruits came to Detroit specifically to train under the new reform model. Detective Bradley had served 4 years of his federal sentence when he was attacked in prison by associates of the criminal organization he had helped expose. He survived the assault, but was left permanently disabled. In an ironic twist, he now worked with federal prosecutors as a consultant on police corruption cases, his detailed knowledge of how corrupt networks operate proving invaluable in preventing future conspiracies. The warehouse on Jefferson Avenue that had served as a hub for the criminal organization's operations had been converted into a community center, offering job training and educational programs for at-risk youth. A plaque by the entrance read, "Dedicated to the honest police officers who choose courage over silence." Marcus's mother, Dorothy Williams, had become an advocate for police reform in her own right. At age 78, she spoke regularly at community meetings and police academies about the importance of accountability in law enforcement. Her story of how her son's courage had protected not just her, but countless other families, had become a powerful tool for recruiting honest young people into police work. The $2 million contract on Marcus's life had never been officially withdrawn, but the criminal organizations that had issued it no longer existed as functional entities. Occasional threats still surfaced from individual criminals seeking revenge, but they lacked the coordination and resources of the previous organized efforts. Marcus still lived under federal protection, but he had learned to find peace within those constraints. His work continued to save lives and protect communities from corrupt law enforcement, and that knowledge sustained him through the isolation and constant vigilance that his position required. On quiet evenings, Marcus would sometimes return to his old house in Detroit, now owned by a young police officer and his family. The new owners had no idea of the historic events that had unfolded in their living room, and Marcus preferred it that way. The house represented not just where his journey had begun, but what he was fighting to protect: the right of every American to feel safe in their own home, regardless of their race or background. The fight against corruption would never truly end, but thanks to the events that began with one racist cop's arrogant mistake, that fight was now being waged with the full force of federal law enforcement and the American justice system behind it. What an incredible journey we've shared together. From a corrupt cop's racist attack to a nationwide transformation of American law enforcement, this story shows us that sometimes the most unlikely events can trigger the most profound changes in our society. Marcus Williams' story reminds us that courage isn't the absence of fear, it's doing what's right even when you're afraid. One man's refusal to be intimidated by a corrupt system led to the exposure of a multi-million-dollar criminal conspiracy and ultimately changed policing across an entire nation. But this story isn't just about one heroic police chief. It's about all the people who found the courage to stand up and do the right thing. Officer Reynolds, who chose integrity over loyalty to corrupt colleagues. Agent Chen, who dedicated her career to fighting corruption. Even Detective Bradley, who eventually chose redemption over continued criminality. The transformation of American law enforcement that began in Marcus's living room continues today. Across the country, honest police officers are speaking out against misconduct, knowing that there are now federal protections and resources available to support them. Young people are joining police departments with the specific goal of reforming law enforcement from within. This story also highlights the power of truth in our modern world. The security cameras that recorded Bradley's evidence planting, the federal monitoring systems that tracked criminal communications, and the courage of witnesses like Reynolds all combined to ensure that justice prevailed over corruption. Perhaps most importantly, this story shows us that change is possible, even when facing systems that seem too powerful or too entrenched to reform. The criminal organization that tried to silence Marcus Williams seemed invincible, with corrupt police officers in multiple states and millions of dollars at their disposal. But they were ultimately defeated by the simple power of honest people refusing to remain silent. As we face ongoing challenges with police accountability and criminal justice reform in our own communities, Marcus Williams's story provides both inspiration and a practical roadmap. Real change happens when ordinary people find extraordinary courage, when whistleblowers are protected and supported, and when federal resources are deployed to support rather than suppress local reform efforts. The legacy of what happened in that Detroit living room continues to ripple outward, protecting communities and saving lives across America. Every corrupt officer who thinks twice before planting evidence, every honest cop who speaks up against misconduct, and every criminal organization that understands they can no longer buy police protection, they're all part of the ongoing impact of Marcus Williams' courage. If you watched until the end, please comment "I watched until the final," and let us know what part of this incredible story impacted you the most. Your engagement helps us continue bringing you these powerful true stories that show how ordinary people can achieve extraordinary justice. Don't forget to click on the video that appears on your screen at the end. We have another amazing story of courage and justice that we think you'll find just as compelling as Marcus Williams' incredible journey from victim to victor. Remember, in a world where corruption and injustice can seem overwhelming, one person with integrity can truly change everything. Be that person in your own community.